Okay, thank you everyone for coming, and welcome to our panel exploring the ethical and moral dimensions of climate interventions and the role of science. I'm Leonardo Valenzuela Perez, and I'm the director of the Global Ecosystem for Ocean Solutions, a program of the UN Ocean Decade, Ocean Visions. And so to start, the challenge posed by climate change are the challenges posed by climate change are already proving to be catastrophic, and the trend is only likely to get much worse unless large-scale changes are introduced. We're now in an uncharted territory with threats that are unique at a planetary scale and require innovative technological solutions to address them, as well as new frameworks to fill the gap between our current political and regulatory systems and the urgent imperative for action. Many climate interventions have been proposed as potential solutions involving the manipulation of Earth systems from geoengineering to carbon removal. While these interventions may be effective in rebalancing the carbon cycle and cooling the planet, they raise a number of ethical questions that span from climate justice concerns to adjustments to our understanding of long-standing frameworks like the precautionary principle in a time of rapidly shifting environmental baselines. What are the risks and benefits of these interventions, and who are likely to be the winners and losers under the techniques currently proposed? Are these interventions designed in a way that ensures that they are participatory, just, and equitable? Do we have appropriate national and international policy frameworks to ensure the rights of those who may be affected by them? In this panel, we will explore these questions and more, and our panel will offer insights into the ethical considerations surrounding climate interventions and the implications for society as a whole. We're fortunate to have today in our panel Billy Williams, Executive Vice President for Ethics, Diversity and Inclusion at the American Geophysical Union. We will have online Chuchi Talati, founder of the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering, and Kilaparthi Ramakrishna, Senior Director of the Marine Policy Center and Senior Advisor on Ocean and Climate Policy to the President of Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution. We hope that this discussion will deepen our understanding of the ethical issues surrounding climate interventions and contribute to the development of responsible and sustainable approaches to addressing climate change. First, we will have a round of 5-minute introductory remarks by our panelists, followed by a 20-minute conversation, and we will dedicate approximately 10, depending on availability of time, 10 minutes at the end of the session for questions from the audience. So to start, we have Billy Williams.
Hello, everyone. As I was introduced, I'm Billy Williams. I serve as Executive Vice President for Ethics, Diversity, and Inclusion at the American Geophysical Union. And for those of you who don't know AGU, we're the world's largest organization of Earth and space scientists, and that gives a little bit of background about why we're leaning into this space. We also have a convening strategy, and our strategic plan calls for us to be very much engaged in pursuing solutions that have global impacts, do it through partnerships, and do it through an inclusive strategy. I've been with AGU for 10 years now. Before AGU, I served as, I was at the National Academy of Sciences, where I led a report on national security implications of climate change for Naval Force, U.S. Naval Forces. I was the study director for that study, and that was my first real foray into climate science. I'm actually an organic chemist by training, and I spent over 25 years at the Dow Chemical Company with some global experiences there. My story, my involvement in ethics, when I get involved with ethics, I joined AGU as Director of Science. So when I was asked to pivot into ethics, diversity, and inclusion, I didn't know whether I was being rewarded or punished. Because as some of you might imagine, I think Brad has referred to House of Cards in a number of cases over the last 2 days. I think in season 1, episode 2 of that show, Kevin Spacek was going to punish someone in Congress by giving them the ethics committee. So nobody wanted to look at ethics. But I think here today we're at a much different place, because what we're talking about today here around climate intervention research, I think the ethics around this are probably one of the most important discussions we can have, and I'm happy to see it on the agenda today. As AGU leaned into this initiative, we leaned into this recognizing that it's an urgent priority for climate intervention research. Is an urgent priority. But more research is needed and more community engagement is needed, and it needs to be done with ethical principles involved. I was very pleased that over the discussion yesterday, for those of you who were here, many of the speakers and topics that were raised were around ethical principles, were around community engagements, were around environmental justice, around monitoring, reporting, and verification. Those are all things that come out when you talk about ethical principles. So our work in AGU is this. So we are actually leading now, trying to facilitate a global conversation around the need for ethical principles to support climate intervention research. So again, it's complex, it's complicated, it's a global initiative, and we're looking at this not just for AGU members, and that's the real challenge here. We're doing this trying to interface with global entities, governments, NGOs. We're not doing this alone. We're partnering with other organizations, with many of you in this room. We are partners on this initiative. And our ultimate goal for this year is to really have some facilitated discussions around this at the COP28 meeting in Dubai. Longer term, AGU is looking to help support this in terms of getting a platform so that people working in space will have the resources and education and knowledge needed to be effective in this arena and get some of the regulatory items that are needed to be effective laid out and facilitated. So I'll stop there.
Okay. So we will go now to Raman and then we'll go to Chochi. So could you?
Hello. Yeah. Thank you very much, Leo. Billy, it's a pleasure to be with you and Shuchi, and I want to thank Brad Ack and Ocean Visions for the invitation to be here. And in the nature of introduction, Leo had talked about my current position at the Woodsole Oceanographic Institution, but I also want to say that I worked for a long period of time with the United Nations and with the Green Climate Fund, and had a role in drafting the Framework Convention on Climate Change and worked on Biodiversity Convention and Kyoto Protocol and various other things. And one of the topics that I take some particular pride in is ensuring that the decisions taken on these extremely important matters are based on a good recognition of what the scientific community says. These are the subsidiary bodies for scientific and technical advice that you find in the Framework Convention on Climate Change and other international bodies. But I want to share with you that it is not an easy proposition. It is all right to say, well, we need to base our decisions on this. And when you add to that the ethical and moral considerations, which is a major topic of this particular panel, it becomes even more complicated. For example, one of the topics of conversation here is ocean-based CDR and a number of other geoengineering techniques that would help us stabilize the global climate system. And we can talk about what sorts of rules should guide that kind of an activity. And in fact, my colleague Ken Bisler and I and Margaret Leinen had written a short piece in Nature last year that talked about how science should lead. And while we did not specifically talk about ethical and moral considerations, the consultation process that we recommended as part of that exercise clearly incorporates that. This is something I'm very pleased to say that many presenters here give certain amount of priority to these issues. So at least we are not trying to convince anybody that this is important and that is recognized. But when we come to the governments, the question is, when do they consider that to be important? And in preparing for this panel, as you know, Leo, we talked about what is it that I might particularly say. And one suggestion was, given the fact that I'm an international lawyer, I don't think there is any other international lawyer in this audience, that I might talk about how this particular topic has been dealt with in international agreements. And when we look at it, outside of human rights agreements, whether it is rights of the child or women or indigenous people, are generally about human rights in general. There is a lot of emphasis on ethical and moral considerations. But when we talk about environmental agreements, you would find some mention of that in both the Biodiversity Convention and in the Framework Convention on Climate Change. But when you think about the details of it, politics obviously come to play. These agreements reflect a growing awareness and importance of ethical considerations in international law, but they are oftentimes subject to what the countries and the power equation that they have in dealing with each other. And the point that we need to recognize is in the world community that we live in, with 197 or however many countries that you see, it's not the same understanding of what we consider to be ethical approach or moral approach. They differ, and then oftentimes they are subjected to various issues that are not entirely satisfactory to us. So given that background, how we try to deal with science, we probably mastered that more or less, with the kinds of scientific assessment that are regularly produced, but we are not anywhere close to that in reaching the ethical and moral considerations in how we deal with it. But that said, what AGU is doing with its approach and the broad consultation process that they are trying to move forward with, it's really moving us in the right direction. There are a number of examples that I want to give you, but I don't know if there is time enough to do that right now. Maybe come to that. Okay, very good. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ram. So now we will have introductory remarks by Tucci Talati, founder of the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Engineering.
Thank you so much. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm so happy to be here to talk about this with you all. I really appreciate the opportunity to touch on such an important part of how we think about climate intervention, and especially how we think about research. So just to kind of briefly introduce myself, so I was most recently in the Biden administration as Chief of Staff of the Office of Fossil Energy and Carbon Management, the Department of Energy, where I was focused on building the initial frameworks for how the administration thinks about carbon dioxide removal. I left last year, and now I'm currently building a new organization, as Leonardo mentioned, focused on the intersections of solar geoengineering, justice, and governance, called the Alliance for Just Deliberation on Solar Geoengineering. I'm also the co-chair of the advisory committee to oversee ScopeX, which would be the first outdoor solar geoengineering experiment, which has been proposed by researchers at Harvard. And so something I just wanted to kind of start with here is diving deeper into the question of how decisions should be made and by whom when it comes to research or deployment, and what that really means for the intersection of this space with justice. And so, when we think about how to achieve ethical outcomes in climate intervention research, good governance is really a key tool. And so I think we use that word a lot. But I think there's a lot of different ways people interpret it, different ways people define it. And so I wanted to kind of talk about what that really means to me and how I think it applies to this space. And so, there are a few different definitions that I draw from, but the way I think about governance is that it's, the structures, processes, and actions through which actors across different sectors, public, private, civil society, interact to address societal goals. And so that includes formal and informal institutions, and all the procedures from making decisions on any scale, whether that be institutional, local, or global. And so, oftentimes governance is thought of as largely restrictive. And so, when we think about research, it's largely thought about in terms of oversight or requiring certain things or trying to limit research. But I think it's really important to remember that governance also means processes or actions that can enable good research as well. And so, a few examples include things like codes of conduct, research funding, and advocacy for different types of work to be pursued. And so that means that actors in governance, really spans a really wide set of stakeholders. And so that means it's not just, policymakers, but it's scientists and academic institutions, funders, and intergovernmental organizations. And so, and I think another really big challenge here when we think about getting to, moral and ethical outcomes is thinking about what good governance means to actually get there. And so, there are a lot of different sets of principles that have attempted to define that. But really broadly speaking, there's just a few things that I want to touch on to kind of kick off this conversation that I think successful and good governance will adhere by. And so, first, governance has to align with and promote justice. And so that means it has to be inclusive. The climate vulnerable communities and countries should be able to participate and represent their interests. And that includes across kind of the way we build research, the way we decide what to research, as well as decisions around deployment. Second is that it has to, start really early to develop norms and standards that can address, different risks and harms for both research and deployment. Third is that I really think we have to think about good governance in the context of legitimacy. Equitable and just processes that promote things like responsibility, transparency, and diversity of thought will help build legitimacy for fields of research. And finally, governance has to ensure that intervention efforts don't deter emissions reductions or adaptation efforts that we're really striving to achieve, regardless of kind of what decisions we make in the intervention space. So I'll stop there, but thank you so much.
Thank you, Georgie. Well, thank you for your remarks. And so I have some questions prepared. And so we have nearly half an hour to complete this task. And so I will start with a question for three of you. Climate interventions have been a very taboo issue for a long time, particularly on the environmental sector with groups that are really key stakeholders in these discussions. So that in a way affects our capacity to have open conversations about the science and about the potential of these solutions or these interventions. What do you think is the contribution of establishing ethical frameworks to facilitate those conversations?
I can start. In my opinion, having the ethical framework, having ethical principles up front would be very key to having those, to help facilitate those conversations. If there's broader awareness of where various communities are coming from, then I think that can open a door for dialogue. I think you'll see in the ethical principles that AGU has proposed or has led the facilitation of, and you'll see those online very shortly. You'll see that if you're abiding by those principles, it opens up a dialogue it could open up a dialogue with any community if you abide by those principles. So I think it's fundamental, especially with the urgency that we need to address the impacts of climate change.
Thanks, Billy.
I mean, I want to join that and agree with the point that Billy has made. But I do want to highlight that whatever that we're talking about, whether it is in terms of certainty with science or consensus in terms of what constitutes ethical and moral principles, we should also be mindful of the urgency of the action that is needed today. For example, we are now at the IPCC assessment report 6. And I don't know, in terms of the urgency, we have learned that much more today than when we go back to IPCC number 1. So we need to be mindful that we need to work in tandem and really focus attention on the urgency of it. The reason why I say that is that I think Shruchi's point is absolutely right on, and we need the governance structures in place. So what we are considering now as experiments, are based with proper understanding and some rules-based framework. If we don't, we have rogue elements. We talk about make sunsets in Mexico. They just went with balloons and released sulfur dioxide without even consulting with the Mexican government. If that is a rogue element, then we take the other examples of China, trying to have these white sheets on the Himalayas so that the heat gets reflected, because they do need the ice, for irrigation purposes not just in China, but in India and Pakistan and so on. what is the framework that governs these kinds of activities? But in all this, while we emphasize the importance of science and the vital participation by the people in terms of the ethical and moral frameworks, we should also be mindful of the urgency of the topic that we're trying to deal with today.
Thank you, Rama. And Chuchi.
Thank you, yeah, so much. I totally agree with my co-panelists. And one more thing I want to add is, when we think about kind of who the conversation has been dictated by thus far, I think it's really important to remember that that's largely been in the global north. And so when we think about how to kind of, think about the next steps of how this conversation grows, where kind of the needs might be around climate vulnerability, and kind of who has the most to gain or lose from solar geoengineering research and knowledge, as well as CDR, it's so important that we think about how we actually achieve the inclusion that we all know is necessary. And so I think, I think a lot of the power structures that we have seen so far, in kind of the climate negotiation space internationally, as well as how we've nationally dictated what types of climate policies that we're supporting, I think we really need to start thinking about how ethical frameworks and justice frameworks can help us be more expansive in pursuing those conversations.
Thank you for that. And on a similar note, there are some long-standing environmental decision-making frameworks, like the precautionary principle. And that type of principle or way of thinking is right now challenged by this, the circumstances, but also by the types of intervention that we see as viable or that have more potential right now. So how do you see the precautionary principle change under these circumstances, and also considering that the environmental baselines that are part of that principle are continuously shifting right now?
I think precautionary principles still apply, but in the right context. Because to me, the precautionary principle is say you need to know more about something before you go full scale with putting it into the environment. And I think that's what our ethical principles are saying as well. We need more research. And the ethical principles will call for more research and also the engagement with communities so people or communities are aware. So I don't see the precautionary principles as being in conflict with what's being proposed here, if you look at the context of what we're dealing with for climate action.
Again, I agree with that. Precautionary principle is oftentimes seen as not doing something until you know more, but there is also a flip side of it. Doing something to avert the problem, also is something that you need to consider. So in the past we talked about burning fossil fuels. Well, if the precautionary principle in that context is, well, don't burn the fossil fuels, rely on alternatives, so you're not releasing the greenhouse gases in the atmosphere. Now, the precautionary principle now is doing whatever that you can to reduce the emissions and sequester the carbon so that we have some kind of an ability to stabilize the global climate system. But doing that has to be done in a manner consistent with what science tells us and what is what Billy just talked about.
Thank you. Chuchi.
Yeah, I fully agree. And I think one more thing I'll just add is in the context of the precautionary principle and research, is just to emphasize this point again around research governance, right? I think the way we get to the outcomes we want around research, the way we actually build the frameworks in which research happens, and the way we actually solicit the types of research we do is so important to actually building the repertoire of knowledge we need to decide whether or not we're going to pursue something. And so I think, that's so critical for not just, getting to the ethical outcomes we want, but actually the substantive input that we're not really seeing right now. And so from a precautionary principle point of view, I really think we're not actually adhering to that because we're not actually thinking about all the other inputs from such a diverse set of countries that aren't yet participating in this. And so we're really not taking into consideration how much more we still have to learn and how urgent that is.
Thank you. And so we are also discussing around this issue, participation, inclusivity, issues of equity to be fundamental. But participation itself is a major international challenge with uneven standards. And we see this in the construction of major infrastructure projects. We see this in democratic governance. So how can we ensure that climate interventions from the potential implementation perspective, include meaningful participatory ways that also take into account the contemporary political landscape?
So should I take that one first? I know she's thought a lot about that specifically.
Thanks, Billy. Yeah, no, I'm happy to. I think there's a few different things. I think the first thing I want to mention is, I've worked a lot of, thinking about participation from both the domestic and international standpoint. And one thing that I think is so critical is that there's such a missing step that we often forget about, which is building the knowledge necessary to enable participation. And doing that in ways that are not biased towards outcomes, right? So, from a CDR perspective, domestically, if a community is, potentially going to be a site for a future CDR or DAC plant, who conducts that engagement, who builds the knowledge there to enable them to be, co-creators and co-decision makers, absolutely must adhere to an ethical framework. Because if you have project developers leading that, there are already outcomes in the way people are using words around engagement, right? We hear a lot around quote unquote public acceptance. And that in itself, I think, is indicative of where they want the community to get to, rather than saying we want to be able to have, a fair conversation and to decide with you. And I think, from an international standpoint, the frameworks that we're going to need around meaningful participation and is going to be immensely complicated and will be really dependent on what participation is for, and kind of where these things are happening. But I think we have a really narrow window of opportunity to build the type of knowledge that we need to across, a very heterogeneous range of countries and communities that are, extremely climate vulnerable. And so thinking about how to do that is what I'm really focused on now with this new organization, and trying to think through how we actually build kind of the structures that we need to, enable inclusion in the first place.
Thank you.
If I could join Shuchi in that, but then bring to the international participatory process. The United Nations sort of perfected this over a period of time by ensuring that the non-state actors have a say in what the governments decide. And this consultative process looks pretty democratic and brings all the actors together, but it's not always results in what you consider as the optimum solution because of the differences that different non-state actors coming from different backgrounds have. And so in other words, what I'm saying is that yes, we need to continue to refine these things in such a way that the core issues of concern are adequately addressed, but how you get at the core issues differs from entity to entity and country to country, and we need to be mindful of that. And how you deal with it makes a huge difference in terms of whether the actors are satisfied with that. So in other words, what I'm trying to do is really raise the possibility that merely because you have this consultative process that you're always going to end up with where you would like to be.
Yeah, and if I could build on that, that process, and we're going through a process now with this initiative, is not going to have perfect results. Not everybody's going to be satisfied, but we can't let that slow us down in terms of how we move to get something in place to help guide those entities who need the guidance and want the guidance. and continue the dialogue as we go forward. Not only just not one-way dialogue, but just inviting in conversations, but acting on those conversations as well.
But if I could just add to that, we are dealing with issues that are very complex in nature. Not everybody has the capacity to understand the details of it, and the general knee-jerk reaction is, if you don't know fully about this, is best to oppose it as opposed to going along with it. And that also is something that we need to think about.
Excellent.
Can I add one more thing too?
Yes,
just
please.
super quickly. I wanted to build on what Dr. Ramakrishna said around non-state actors, which I think is such a key point. I think, there really aren't enough efforts to kind of build capacity both around science and research in, a much, more like diverse set of places. And then also building governance capacity on really thinking about not just the fundamental understanding and knowledge behind these interventions, which is a critical foundation, but also, thinking about how you build capacity for enabling that engagement, to understand kind of what skills are necessary to engage in governance, to implement governance. And I think, in the past, the civil society and non-state actors that have been able to participate in processes might look very different around different topics, and could also, be very privileged as well, right? It's not just state actors and governments that are privileged, it's also these non-state actors. And so I think we just need to start really having a much more expansive conversation on kind of who's able to participate and how we kind of really build that out. And that doesn't necessarily make anyone a good or bad actor, right? There's no inherent good or bad actor in these spaces, but it's thinking about what we really mean by inclusion and building that into any ethical framework that guides these decisions.
I would just ask to something you mentioned, Rama, that there are already certain mechanisms that could be helpful in this process. And there are principles like free, prior, and informed consent, part of the ILO process for indigenous participation, for example. Do you think there is a way to incorporate the process now of these ethical frameworks and into existing processes for the approval of large-scale infrastructure projects?
Right. I mean, prior informed consent also is part of the international agreement. They have now tried to bring that about, to really quite large number of actors in it. But for that to be effective, you need to build capacity. You need to make sure that people understand the complexity of the issues that we're trying to deal with and what is involved in it. And, as experts in the field, we generally get impatient. You have done everything that you need to do, and this is the best solution that you come up with, and then to have to explain to anybody that this is really, in fact, that, people just don't have the patience for it. And so, but at the same time, that does not mean that we ignore that part of it, but we need to walk the extra mile in making sure that people understand what it is that we're trying to deal with and what are the issues involved in it.
So we have some time for, I would say, 2 quick questions from the audience, if we have them. Oh, okay. So we have one online question.
Yeah, so we have a question from an online participant. So Ross is wondering about thinking about debates that hold up research as opposed to scale deployment when we're talking about climate interventions. And how can voices, similar to those of you who are here now, be more vocal about being pro-research, where everybody learns, even as these ethical, moral, and guidance debates are unfolding?
I can jump in really quickly from my perspective. So, I think for me, the question isn't around being pro or anti-research. It's being really conscious of the way research happens and ensuring that good and responsible research is their priority across sectors. And when we think about, this idea of being pro-research and the idea that everybody learns, well, that's not always the case. And so we have to think about the context in a much more expansive research discussion, a much more expansive set of researchers that are given the same set of tools that we have, like especially in the United States. So like thinking about access to the right types of computers, access to the right types of models, access to the right type of systems to run different kinds of models. And that's really not true right now. And so I just want to emphasize this question, not of pro or con, but how.
Thanks.
Yeah, and I would add to that, that as we look at the question of supporting research, we've had a lot of discussion early on in our workshops and our summits around, are we proposing principles that's going to guide things that happen inside the laboratory, modeling other things? And some have proposed that there should be a bright line. They were only talking about things that go outdoor for external outdoor field testing or whatever. And our principles reject the concept of a bright line. Our thoughts are that the things you model even will have influence on what happens once you start thinking about further testing. So I think there's some principles here that supports research, but not everybody would agree with those principles. But that's why we invite your comments and feedback on those items.
Now, if I could add to that, it is not just between those that want action, those that want to do research more, and the public. It is even amongst the scholars that are engaged in this topic, you need more conversation and collaboration. For example, online you have seen folks signing up to saying geoengineering no and geoengineering yes, and then both have some pretty solid arguments. I mean, these are all people who are very well versed in the topic that they're talking about, but it requires a certain level of patience in terms of working with it. I'm pleased to say that I work with Ken Bissler, my colleague at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution, and he started this Exploring Ocean Iron Solutions. And then he brought together lots of different labs and experts from different places. And participating in those discussions, it is very clear to me that even amongst all these experts, there is a lot of conversation that need to take place to understand each other and then move forward. So it is the nature of the beast that we are trying to deal with, and then we should be mindful of that. And so if this is the problem, even amongst the experts, you can understand the extra mile you need to walk in terms of reaching the public.
Excellent.
Can I add one more really quick thing?
Yes, please.
One more addition I just want to make too is that research is also not homogeneous, right? Different scales of research have very different debates surrounding them. And you can't necessarily think about research in a vacuum outside of a moral debate, right? Because if you think about, for example, small scale research in the ocean space that requires engaging with the community where you are pilot testing something in a coastal area, are you doing that in a way that you have consent and agreement from the community? Is the community benefiting from the work you're doing? Where are you doing it? Are you doing it in places where they have those rights? So these are not things that can exist separately. And so I just wanted to add that point as well.
Thanks. So we have two questions from Ken Bissler and Brad Ack.
Thank you.
We have
Ken Bissler from Woods Hole, and we all appreciate, I think, in this room, this discussion of ethical standards. What I want to do to maybe elaborate on a bit is, should the funding agencies, the people on the other side of that wall who are talking, or the philanthropies, or the companies seeking venture capital, should we kind of demand, should they say, we're not going to receive your support unless you abide by these? Do you think we should be taken to that level? It seems we need some more encouragement for people to take this on.
Again, if I could respond, I would say absolutely yes. I think that's where you really get the adoption, the engagement, the discussions that are needed. We're having discussions currently with National Science Foundation in the U.S. with the National Science Foundation, with DOE and OSTP and others. But we have a ways to go in terms of getting to that spot. But I think that would be critical to have the principles broadly adopted and endorsed.
Brad.
So I'm minded being flanked here by other sentient creatures on this planet that we haven't talked about the rights of nature in this discussion. I have a colleague, David de Rothschild, who's been working for years to try and get nature a seat at the UN. I'm aware that some countries have actually written the rights of nature into their constitution. I'd love to hear maybe this is an international law question, how we deal with the rights of nature. And also, we haven't mentioned people who don't exist yet, who will come into this planet 10 years from now, 20, 30, and what rights they have in this discussion. So I'm just curious as to your reflections on both of those.
Well, you'd be pleased to know, Brad, that the United Nations has adopted resolutions that factor in this particular topic. And the UN General Assembly recently deciding on seeking an advisory opinion from the International Court of Justice, again on matters like this. So there is a lot of progress that is being made. But these are very long and tedious processes, as you well know. And the reason for those things to have come about is because of the island states in the world, and they have made this into a question of survival. And so it's not going back into going before a court of law. You always needed to have a standing to sue. Do trees have a standing? Do ocean, does the ocean should have standing? Are the sentient creatures that you're talking about, have standing? And I think, the law as it is evolving is going in that direction more and more. And I think that is really worth, thinking about and seeing how we could provide more detail, so that we could work with it. There are folks who are now trying to exactly say this about the ocean broadly, not just in terms of the creatures that are in it, that it should be considered as an entity in itself and has rights, not because it serves our purposes, but for its own purposes, and that we have to think about protecting them.
Kelly.
Thanks. So the area that I work a lot in, solar radiation modification, but I think shared with other climate interventions, the research is highly overlapping with basic science processes and highly overlapping with other anthropogenic influences in the kinds of models you want to do and the kinds of observations you might need in some of the scenarios you want to run. And so part of my question is is there cognizance of that? Because there's been kind of a tendency to position geoengineering as this sort of separate lane. But it's highly overlapping with these other areas of science. And environmental science and climate science, a lot of care has been taken to keep political influences out and to keep, keep the influences of, where the winds blow, because if we start to introduce political influences in this area of science, it may not be limited to these active perturbations. It may also have other ways of engaging with it. And the reason that I ask is because, I work closely with a lot of researchers, and they're really working on how do we improve models' ability to represent these processes, how do we improve observations, and it's something that, from our perspective, is a really important thing to move on fairly quickly. And so I just wanted to, I wanted to raise that here because I know and appreciate my organization natively engages with people from all over the world at all levels of our organization. But, there's a lot of concern that we continue to generate evidence and that we don't inadvertently also maybe introduce barriers to other kinds of science.
Yeah, Kelly, if I could just respond to that. So thank you for raising that, because that's an issue that in our initiative, we don't hit head on, but we're well aware of some of the national security implications in this area as well. Those are discussions that are occurring on the side. We are aware of those. We have some of our people are engaged in those, but it's not front and center in what we're doing. I'm not sure whether that was what you're addressing, the geopolitical aspects are.
No, so for example, putting aerosols in the stratosphere, in the program at NOAA, that's a dual purpose program to look at anthropogenic influences in the stratosphere, as well as, potential intentional ones.
Yes.
And so, that's, and obviously in the lower troposphere, same thing. So, it's about when we're trying to introduce frameworks that might influence what scientists can research, what it costs them to do it, how long it takes them, or whether they can get their research approved in these categories, like have we considered fully that these are, embedded atmospheric or, ocean science areas of research?
Yeah, our intent, at least from what we're facilitating, is that these principles will help facilitate the research as opposed to put up barriers or additional roadblocks for the work to take place. And our framework is at a high enough level that it includes both CDR research as well as SRA, as well as solar radiation modification work. And you and I have had discussions in the past, so there's a lot more to be done. But one call to action I would leave for everyone is to be sure to look at these principles that are being evolved and developed and engage with us in conversation. If you see something you think is out of line or think it needs to be more fully developed or have different voices brought in, because we're doing our best along with other organizations to make this real for everyone in a pretty urgent fashion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Billy. And join me in thanking our speakers. It was a great panel and very timely celebration.